Welcome to the Mad Genius Thesis. Have you ever wondered if there's a link between those incredible creative minds and mental illness?
Well, it's a question people have been asking for ages, and we're going to really dig into it today.
We're going to be looking closely at psychology of creativity, Light, Dusk, and Dark Night of Soul by Vladimir Kozlov.
Sounds intriguing.
And right away, Kozlov throws out this really interesting idea
Okay, I'm listening.
that some people are so driven to create them that they almost don't care about anyone or anything else.
Whoa, that's pretty intense. So, they're so focused on their creative goals that other people's feelings or values just don't even register.
Exactly. It's like Kozlov is saying that their creative drive is so strong, it can make them indifferent to the people around them.
I can see how that could be true in some cases. They're so obsessed with their vision that nothing else matters.
Right. And it makes you wonder if that single-mindedness is part of what makes them so brilliant.
Yeah.
But it also makes you think about the potential downsides.
Yeah, for sure. What are the costs of that kind of intense focus?
We'll definitely be talking about that later on. But first, maybe we should try to define creativity. What do you think of when you hear that word?
I think for me, it's about coming up with something totally new and original. It could be a painting, a scientific discovery, even just a new way of thinking about a problem.
And I like that. And Kozlov seems to agree. He says a creative person can think beyond the limits of what society tells them, or even what seems physically possible. Like, they're not just breaking social norms, they're pushing the boundaries of the physical world.
Wow, that's deep. So it's not about being different for the sake of being different. It's about actually changing how we understand and experience the world. What do you think, listener? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it gets to the heart of what real creativity is. But it also brings us back to that question, is that kind of thinking somehow connected to mental illness?
Yeah, right. If you're always challenging everything and pushing the limits, does that make you more likely to have psychological problems?
That's a tough one. We'll have to look at that carefully. But before we get into the potential downsides, I think it's important to talk about how amazing creativity can be.
Definitely.
Like, have you ever heard of the flow state?
Oh, yeah, sure. When you're so into what you're doing that you lose track of time.
Exactly. It's that feeling of being totally absorbed in something, where time just disappears and you're completely focused on the task at hand.
Kozlov says it's like intense concentration, where you're not even really aware of yourself anymore. You're just completely in the moment.
Yeah, it's like you become one with the creative process. I know I feel that when I'm writing. The words just seem to flow effortlessly. Have you ever felt that, listener?
And it's not just writers, right? Athletes, musicians, artists, scientists, they all talk about this flow state where they're performing at their best, and it feels almost effortless.
So is this flow something anyone can experience? Or is it just for creative types?
Well, Kozlov seems to think anyone can get into a flow state, but it's especially important for creative work.
Interesting. I've also heard that your brain actually changes when you're in that creative zone. Is that true?
Yeah, there's research on that. Studies have shown that when you're in a flow state, the part of your brain responsible for planning and decision-making actually slows down.
Really? So you're not overthinking things as much?
Right. And at the same time, the areas of your brain that deal with focus, attention, and senses become more active. So it's like your brain is switching gears to let you fully immerse yourself in the present moment.
Fascinating. It's almost like our brains are wired for creativity.
It does seem that way.
But even though flow sounds awesome,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that creativity has a dark side too.
Right. Well, it makes sense that being so focused on creating could have some downsides.
Like what?
Well, Kozlov talks about how for some people, it can lead to them losing interest in everyday life. Like they might neglect their relationships or even forget to take care of themselves.
So their creative pursuits become their whole world.
Exactly. It's like everything else just fades away. And for some, this intense focus can even make them lose touch with reality.
Oh, wow. That's a little scary.
Yeah, Kozlov calls it self-oblivion, where someone gets so absorbed in their creative world that they lose themselves and their connection to the real world.
Like they disappear into their own imagination.
Kinda. And he uses Vincent van Gogh as an example, the famous painter.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Van Gogh struggled with mental illness his whole life and ultimately took his own life. Kozlov connects this, at least in part, to the potential dangers of an uncontrolled creative drive.
That's a powerful reminder that even though creativity can be amazing, we need to be careful not to let it consume us.
Definitely. It's a balancing act.
So how do we find that balance? How do we make sure our creativity helps us without hurting us?
Well, Kozlov says self-awareness is key. You need to understand your own creative process, know when you're getting burned out, and be able to take a step back when you need to.
Makes sense. It's like being mindful of your creative energy, just like you'd be mindful of your physical or emotional energy.
Exactly. And he also talks about how important it is to have social connections, people who can support you and give you a different perspective. Because remember, creative people can sometimes isolate themselves and lose touch with the outside world.
It sounds like it's all about finding that middle ground between diving deep into your creative world and staying connected to the real world and the people around you.
You got it. It's tricky, but important.
It's also interesting that Kozlov looks at how society affects creativity, not just the individual. He says that societies that encourage creativity tend to be more innovative and progressive.
Yeah, that's a great point. It makes you wonder if we're doing enough to support creativity in our society.
For sure. It makes you think about whether we're creating spaces where people feel comfortable expressing themselves or if we're holding them back.
It's a big question, and it shows how important this conversation is. It's not just about individuals, it's about creating a world where creativity can thrive. And everyone feels supported in their creative endeavors.
I think that's a great place to stop for now.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
But there's still so much more to talk about. We'll be back for part 2 of our deep dive into psychology of creativity, where we'll be looking at different viewpoints on creativity, the idea of the creative Superman, and even the spiritual side of the creative process.
Welcome back. We've been talking about finding that balance between getting lost in your creative world and staying grounded in reality. One thing I really like about this book is how Kozlov brings in so many different perspectives on creativity.
I know, right? It's not just his own take. He brings in all these other thinkers, which makes it so much more interesting.
Yeah, like L.S. Vygotsky. Remember him from psychology class?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
He was all about how social interaction and culture play a huge role in shaping creativity.
Oh, right. So it's not just about some talent you're born with, but how you interact with the world around you.
Exactly. Kozlov also talks about May, who was an existential psychologist. May believed that creativity is how we find meaning in a world that can feel kind of crazy and chaotic.
So it's not just about making pretty things. It's about trying to understand the big questions of life, like why are we here? What's it all about?
Yeah, deep stuff. And it makes me think about what you were saying earlier about creative people pushing boundaries and challenging norms. Maybe they're doing that because they're really searching for answers.
That's a cool connection. Kozlov also brings up Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs guy, right?
Yep, that's the one. Maslow thought of creativity as a kind of peak experience, like when you're at the top of your game and fulfilling your potential.
Ah, so it's like that top level of Maslow's pyramid where you're becoming the best version of yourself.
Right, and it's interesting how he connects that to creativity.
It seems like all these different viewpoints share a common idea, that creativity is about more than just skills or talent. It's a really important part of what makes us human.
Totally agree. It's how we connect with ourselves, each other, and maybe even something bigger than ourselves.
So speaking of pushing boundaries, Kozlov has this whole section about the creative Superman.
Yes. It sounds kind of dramatic, I know, but stick with me here.
Okay, I'm all ears. So does he actually think creative people have superpowers?
Not quite. He's talking about how the act of creating can push someone beyond their normal limits. It's like they reach a state of higher awareness, like they're transcending themselves through their creativity.
So it's like creativity helps you unlock your full potential.
Yeah, exactly. He uses Superman as a metaphor, like someone rising above the ordinary. Think about those times when you're so into what you're doing that you completely lose track of time, like you can do anything.
Oh, I know that feeling. But doesn't that kind of sound like that self-oblivion thing we talked about before?
Mm-hmm.
Like you get so lost in your creative world that you lose touch with reality.
You're right. There's a connection there. It's like a paradox, this balance between getting completely immersed in your creativity and staying grounded at the same time. Kozlov says that striving to be this creative Superman can get lonely because it often means you need to isolate yourself from distractions.
So you need that solitude to be creative, but you
Yeah.
also need connection like we talked about before.
Yeah, it's tricky. You need both. And Kozlov is honest about the challenges. He says this kind of solitary pursuit can make people feel isolated, misunderstood, even alienated from others.
Makes sense. If you're always seeing the world differently, you might not always fit in.
Exactly. But Kozlov also says it's not impossible. He talks about finding balance, being aware of yourself, and getting support when you need it.
So you don't have to become a hermit and hide from the world. It's more about finding a way to keep your creativity alive while staying connected to people and things that ground you.
Right. He also dives into this idea of impracticality, which he says is a common trait in creative people.
Impracticality, like what does he mean by that?
Well, he noticed that lots of creative people, like artists and thinkers, often neglect practical stuff, like managing their money, following social norms, even taking care of themselves. It's like their minds are so busy creating that everyday things kind of fall by the wayside.
So it's like they're focused on the big ideas, the grand vision, and they don't sweat the small stuff.
Exactly. It's like they see the world through a different lens. They value imagination and self-expression more than practicality and fitting in.
Interesting. And he sees this impracticality as a good thing.
Yeah. He doesn't see it as a weakness, but as a strength. I mean, we can't all abandon our responsibilities and just live in a fantasy world. But maybe we could all benefit from being a little bit more impractical, a little more spontaneous and creative in our lives.
I like that. It's a good reminder that sometimes the most meaningful things in life aren't necessarily the most practical ones.
Totally agree. Kozlov then goes on to talk about some of the darker sides of creativity, like that pull towards self-oblivion and the potential for self-destruction.
It's heavy stuff, but we kind of touched on that earlier. There's that whole tortured artist stereotype, and I think Kozlov is trying to get us to think more deeply about this connection between creativity and mental health.
Absolutely. He's not afraid to talk about the dark side of creativity, but he also doesn't want us to romanticize it. He talks about those tragic cases of artists and writers who really struggled, but he also makes it clear that not everyone who's creative will experience those extremes.
So it's not about saying that being creative automatically means you're going to suffer. It's more about recognizing that creative people face unique challenges and being open about mental health.
Yeah. Instead of romanticizing mental illness, he says we need to focus on supporting and helping creative people who are struggling. And a big part of that is getting rid of the stigma around mental health so people feel comfortable asking for help.
Right. It's about creating a safe space where people feel supported and showing that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength.
He also talks a lot about prevention, like promoting self-care, building supportive communities, encouraging healthy ways to cope with stress. It's not just about treating mental illness after it happens. It's about creating an environment that supports well-being from the start.
It's like shifting from reacting to problems to proactively building a culture that values both creativity and mental health.
Exactly. Kozlov really wants us to think about how we can better support and encourage creativity in all its forms. It's not just a nice to have, it's crucial for our well-being as individuals and as a society.
That brings us to something else really fascinating. He talks about how creative people experience the world differently. He talks about this tendency for creative people to anthropomorphize nature and objects.
Oh, yeah, like giving human qualities to things that aren't human. It's so interesting, right? They're not just looking at the world, they're really feeling it, connecting with it on a deeper level.
And Kozlov says this comes from being extra sensitive and having a deep connection to the world around them. Like they see beauty and wonder in everything, even in ordinary things that most people might overlook.
It's like they're experiencing the world through a more colorful and vibrant lens.
And he even says that this unique way of seeing things can make their art more powerful, more meaningful. Their art becomes a reflection of how they see and experience the world.
Beautiful, isn't it? It's like their art becomes a window into their soul.
I love that. And it's something we can all try to do, even if we don't think of ourselves as artists in the traditional sense.
Totally. We can all work on cultivating that sense of wonder and appreciation for the world around us.
Speaking of practical things, it's cool how Kozlov doesn't just throw all these abstract ideas at us. He actually offers some real advice for creative people on how to deal with the challenges and avoid the pitfalls.
Yeah, he doesn't just point out the problems. He tries to offer solutions. He knows how hard the creative life can be, and he wants people to be able to thrive.
So what kind of advice does he give?
Well, he really stresses self-awareness, like understanding your own creative process, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, and recognizing the signs of burnout before it hits you too hard.
It's like knowing how to take care of your creative engine, knowing how to keep it running smoothly.
I like that. And he also talks about balance again. It's not about working yourself to death for your art. It's about finding a sustainable rhythm that lets you be creative without burning out.
So it's about making creativity a healthy and lasting part of your life.
Exactly. He also encourages people to find joy in the process of creating itself, not just in the end result or what other people think.
So it's about that internal drive, that love of creating, no matter what comes of it.
Yes. He believes that when you're truly passionate, the act of creating is its own reward.
That's a really important message, especially in a world where we're constantly being judged and compared to others.
It is. And he reminds us that even though the creative life has its challenges, it's also deeply rewarding and fulfilling. It lets us connect with our true selves, express our unique view of the world, and maybe even touch something bigger than ourselves.
It's like he's saying that creativity is a gift, and even though it might come with some baggage, it's something to be treasured.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about all these different perspectives on creativity, the idea of the creative Superman, the challenges of being impractical and feeling isolated, and the importance of knowing yourself and finding balance.
It's been a great exploration of how complex this whole relationship between creativity and mental health really is.
Welcome back. We've been having a really interesting conversation about this whole idea of creativity and mental health.
Yeah, Kozlov's book has really made me think about things in a new way.
Me too. Before we left off, we were talking about Kozlov's advice for living a creative life. I really like what he said about finding joy in the creative process itself, not just worrying about what other people think.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in trying to be successful and get recognition, but real creativity comes from that passion and enjoyment of just creating something.
Have you ever felt that, listener? That pure joy of being totally lost in a project, whether it's painting or writing a song or even just building something in your workshop. You know, those times when you completely forget about everything else and you're just in the zone.
Those moments are pure magic, and Kozlov reminds us to really appreciate them. It's about tapping into that childlike sense of wonder and playfulness, that pure delight in making something new.
He also talks about the importance of self-awareness, right? Like knowing your own creative rhythms, your strengths, your weaknesses.
Exactly. It's like being in tune with your own creative energy, knowing when you're in a flow state and just going with it, but also recognizing when you need to take a break and recharge.
And one thing I really appreciate is how much he emphasizes community and support. He reminds us that even though creative work can be solitary, we don't have to go it alone.
It's so important to have people in your life who understand and support your creative journey. You know, people who can encourage you, give you feedback, and just listen when you need to talk things out.
Yeah, sometimes it helps to get an outside perspective on your work, someone who can see things you might have missed or offer a fresh viewpoint.
Exactly. It's about finding your tribe, the people who really get you and your creative quirks, people who challenge you to grow and celebrate your wins with you.
Looking back on everything we've discussed, it really hits me how complicated this relationship between creativity and mental health really is. It's not a simple question of whether creative people are more prone to mental illness.
You're right. It's not black and white at all. And I think Kozlov does a great job of showing us that. There are definitely challenges that come with being a creative person, but there are also incredible rewards and a deep sense of fulfillment that can come from tapping into your creative potential.
One of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of finding that balance. You know, nurturing your creativity while also taking care of your mental and emotional health. It's about finding that sweet spot between getting lost in your creative world and staying connected to the real world and the people you love.
And remembering that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It actually takes a lot of strength and self-awareness to reach out when you're struggling.
It really does. So if you're out there and you're feeling overwhelmed or lost, please reach out to someone you trust. Whether it's a friend, a family member, a therapist, or a mentor. There are people who care about you and want to see you succeed.
Absolutely. Don't forget that you're not alone in this. And remember that creativity is a gift, a powerful force that can bring so much beauty and meaning to our lives and the world around us. Embrace your creativity, nurture it, and don't be afraid to share your unique vision.
That's a great message to end on. So to all our listeners, as you continue on your own creative journeys, keep in mind what we've learned from Kozlov. Take care of yourself, build your support network, and most importantly, find joy in the act of creating.
Who knows, maybe you'll be the next creative genius to make a real impact on the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of creativity and mental health. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Mad Genius Thesis. Until then, keep those creative sparks flying.